Hello, my name is Joni Barrett with Out the Box Mind Body Studio, and this is Jan. And we are going to demonstrate today how to come into Sukhasana, or easy seated pose. And this is a posture pose because we sit a lot and we need to know how to sit well. So this is going to be where we're going to really learn how to sit, number one, comfortably in Sukhasana, which is a pose you're going to see in almost every yoga class, but also how just to sit comfortably everywhere that you go and you sit. Very important skill to have. So first of all, we need to have an understanding of the pelvis itself. So I'm going to grab my pelvis model. So a little bit about the pieces. So this is the sacrum and this is the tailbone. Back here are your SI joints. I'm going to flip it around. Pubic bone. These are your ischial tuberosities. In yoga, you're going to hear them called sits bones. These are the two halves of the iliums. ASIS, I call them in my class the front of the pelvis or the hip points. I'm going to be calling them that as well as ASIS. And then the other thing to really think about whenever we are coming into Sukhasana is that this is the pelvis, but then out of here is where the spine will start to extend. And out of here, this is your acetabulum, this is where the femurs will start to extend. So I'm going to just bring in my big skeleton here for just a moment so you can kind of get an idea of that, because knowing about the curves of the spine is important when we come into a seated position. So this is the pelvis on this skeleton, the sacrum. This is the low back or the lumbar. This is the T-spine. Then it goes back up into the cervical spine, the neck, and then if he had a head, it would go here. If you notice in the lumbar, it has what we call an in curve, an out curve in the T-spine, an in curve in the neck. These curves should be present in your body. Everybody's curves are a little bit different, but we never want to flatten this curve or flatten this curve. We want those to be there. So that's important to remember, because when we come into our Sukhasana or any seated position, we're going to be using what does the lumbar feel like, what does this low back feel like, to know that we're in a good place for our own body. And then I'm going to turn him around. And we're going to take a really quick look here at this femur, this leg bone. So the hip sockets are on the front of the body, and this is where it comes in at. They're not on the sides of the body, they're here at the front. And the legs are designed in our body to just fall out of the socket. If you come into a posterior tilt, and I'm going to show this model here so you can maybe get an idea of it. This would be a posterior tilt, and this is the way a lot of people sit. They wind up sitting back here on the sacrum. When you do that, it makes the femur, this leg bone, jut up into the air. So when you sit back like this in the sacrum, this leg bone will actually come up and then have to go back down. So you're inadvertently tightening your hip flexors just by placing the pelvis into this position. And that's not what we want in yoga or in life, is to tighten up our hip flexors. So that's just a little bit of information you need to know before we come into the pose. And I will put these toys away. So we're going to have Jan go ahead and come into Sukhasana, and we're going to do it without any sort of a prop first. And then we're going to show how to use the props. So whenever we come into Sukhasana, we're going to think about finding those ischial tuberosities or those sits bones. So Jan, I'm just going to have you reach under and see if you can find yours. And what they feel like is some bones, some feet. I sometimes call them the feet of the pelvis. And then you're actually going to broaden them out a little bit. Good. I'm going to turn this around and just show what's happening as she's broadening. It actually will open up that SI joint a little bit. So without the broadening, a lot of times we close that SI joint and it causes discomfort in the low back. So just by broadening them out, you can get just a little bit more space. So, and again, ideally, we're sitting on the sits bones. We're not sitting back here on the sacrum, which is going to cause the leg bones to have the trajectory of up and then down. And so then from there, we're going to come and we're just going to do a real quick check of our lumbar or our low back. So you can just take your own hand and just make sure you have a little bit of an incurve. Remember, everybody has a little bit different. What you really want to make sure is it doesn't feel flat or that you feel the bones of the spine jutting out behind you. So you're just going to check yourself. And once you have that, and I'm going to come down here, is we're going to think about the rib cage. So the rib cage will go back a little bit, and you should feel yourself kind of line up into the bowl of the pelvis. And then, again, we're just going to brush the back of the head just lightly, and it's going to cause the chin to gently drop. And I'm going to have you turn to the side, Jan, so they can get a side view of that whole setup. So you'll come into your easy seated pose, Sukhasana. You'll broaden the sits bones, making sure you're sitting in them. You'll check your lumbar, your low back. Just make sure it feels soft there or that the bones aren't poking out. Then you're going to come to your rib cage, draw it back slightly. You'll take your hand and gently brush all the way up and just feel that gentle drop of the chin. Hands rest onto the thighs. The arms should feel completely supported by the pelvis. There shouldn't be any tension in the neck. There shouldn't be any tension in the shoulder girdle. So I'm going to show just a little bit of misalignment. So these are things that we don't want to see. So Jan, first I'm going to have you pinch your shoulder blades together. So we don't want this. If you can see that it causes the chin to jut forward and it causes the rib cage to come forward. So go ahead and erase that one. And then we don't want that posterior tilt. So go ahead and come into the posterior tilt. And this is the one I see the most often. So if you can see, hopefully you can get a good visual here that the back has flattened here. So come back into your neutral. See, we have now a little bit of an incurve, and then come back posterior. And now we've lost that. So go ahead and come back. Good. So let's say you've done broaden the sits bones, you've drawn the rib cage back, and it still just doesn't feel good in your body. We're going to use a prop. Now, the reason to use a prop is not to make the pose easier. The reason to use the prop is to make the pose so that you can get something out of it. If you just can't get comfortable in this pose, then you're not going to become more mobile. So I'm going to first of all grab a blanket, and we're going to show you how to set up on a blanket. So most studios you go to will have a yoga blanket available. You can use a towel. So you're going to take that blanket and you're just going to roll it up and give yourself just a little bit of height there. And then you're going to go ahead and sit up onto that little blanket roll. And hopefully now you can find those sits bones. And then you're just going to let the legs open. So we want, if you can use the blanket is optimal for you, because if it's something too big, it hits the back of the femurs, and that basically does the same thing as a posterior tilt. It forces the femurs to have to go up and then down, which tightens hip flexors. It's not getting us what we want. So once she's in her sits bones, she'll check her rib cages back. She's going to do a gentle brushing of the back of the head, and she can just check her lumbar and just see, and this actually looks really good. That height is nice for you. So let's say you've done this, and you're like, you know what, it still just is not comfortable for me. Your next option is to use, this is a meditation seat, but a lot of yoga studios will have just a little pillow. So, and these are nice because they do the same thing the blanket does. It gives space for those femurs. So if you'll notice, it's not hitting the backs of the legs. And so she'll broaden through the sits bones. And they usually have a little bit of a, almost like a beanbag feel. So it actually makes it easier to find those sits bones. And then she'll just check in, and actually it's looking really good because we've done it so many times. Okay, so that is that option. Now say you still are like, this is just not working. The next option is to go to even more heights. So you can use a thicker bolster. So we'll go ahead and switch that out. Now with the thicker bolster, sometimes you do have to be careful because this can hit up against the leg bones. So she's still going to want to just be on the edge of that. There you go. And the more height we give, it usually is even easier to find the sits bones, which is why the prop is nice. Very good. And if you see, it just brings her up enough so that now she has a nice in curve here. Rib cage looks good, and she has a nice in curve in the neck. So those are all options. I would really encourage you not to be uncomfortable with using a prop whenever you come into easy seated pose, because it has a lot of value to be able to sit well and to be able to sit on the floor well. So this is Joni Barrett with Out the Box Mind Body Studio, and thank you for joining me.